Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really unflinching look at something massive, one of the most urgent dynamics, really, of our century, this crisis of urban development. Specifically, we're focusing on how the world's fastest-growing cities, mostly in the global south, are coping, or perhaps more accurately, how they're struggling with just monumental change. And our mission today, it's quite specific. We're not really here for the easy answers or, the policy platitudes. We want to dive deep into the structural forces shaping these cities, and crucially, critique why so many well-intentioned sort of mainstream solutions seem to have failed to fix the core problems.
And I think we have to start by just grasping the sheer scale of this. It's unprecedented. Historians talk about the first urbanization wave, right? North America, Europe, roughly 1750 to 1950. That was, what, a two-century process? The urban population grew by maybe 400 million people?
Okay, 400 million over 200 years.
Yeah. Now, compare that to what we're living through, the second wave. We're talking 1950 to, say, 2030, just 80 years. And in that time, the urban population in less developed regions is set to jump from about 300 million to nearly 3.9 billion.
Yeah.
It's a human migration event unlike anything the world has ever seen before.
That's not just growth, that's exponential. You said 10,000 years for the first billion city dwellers, and now we're adding the next billion in projected, 15 years?
15 years. Between roughly 2003 and 2018, it's this incredibly compressed, high-velocity demographic explosion. And something like 80% of this growth right now is happening in Asia and Africa. The speed alone, it just fundamentally challenges how we normally think about governing cities.
Right. Which brings us to kind of the frame we need for this conversation. Because if you just view a city like a machine, something you can manage with a spreadsheet, well, our sources suggest that's just doomed to failure. What's the concept they use, the essential idea for understanding these complex places?
The key idea, though it sounds a bit academic, is seeing cities as dissipative, complex systems with emergent properties. But basically what that means is cities are open-ended. They're always becoming something different. They constantly throw up these infinite, unpredictable dynamics. So this sort of confident claim that, we just need simple, rational policies, it's really problematic because the city is fundamentally shaped by power, by surprise, by things you just can't predict.
Okay. So power, surprise, contingency.
Yeah.
Not need spreadsheets. Let's dive into where this explosive growth is most visible then. The most obvious sign of this rapid, often chaotic urbanization has to be the informal settlement, the slum. Back in 2001, something like 43% of the urban population in developing countries lived in slums. What's the core economic engine driving this huge segregation?
Well, a primary driver, is globalization and the relentless pressure that puts on local governments. Cities feel absolutely compelled to prioritize what we might call economic infrastructure. The high-quality transport, the cutting-edge telecom, the specialized logistics hubs, all the stuff needed to attract those transnational corporate investors and get that coveted world-class city label.
And in that race for global connectivity, what gets left behind? What's sacrificed?
Pretty much everything else, specifically what the academics call social reproduction infrastructure, which is just, the basics, the stuff that keeps ordinary people alive and healthy. Basic sanitation, public water access, local schools, clinics. Local governments get caught in this bind. They chase the global elite, the corporate dollar, and that almost always reinforces the marginalization of the urban majority who desperately need those basic services.
And that dynamic where the infrastructure itself gets split. That's what Graham and Marvin called splintering urbanism, right? That old ideal, that sort of high modern promise of, universal water or electricity for everyone. That's just eroding.
Precisely. Gone. We've seen this huge wave of corporatization, privatization of services, which shifts everything to a user pays model. So private companies, they cherry pick. They only invest in the low risk, high return projects, connecting only the profitable bits of the city. And the city stops being this single integrated thing. It becomes balkanized, a patchwork of service enclaves right next to disconnected peripheries.
Okay, and here's where it gets really concrete for people listening. Let's look at the physical and the financial inequality this creates. We see the rise of gated communities, right? These exclusive enclaves with totally tailor-made services. Expert, you had that data plan on Cape Town. How they map this out?
Yeah, the Cape Town example is quite stark. They do this detailed geodemographic segmentation, and they literally identify groups like silver spoons who get customized, top-tier infrastructure, communications, security, roads completely separate from the labor pool, the high-density family neighborhoods. These groups might live side by side geographically, but they inhabit totally different urban realities in terms of services.
But the financial gap, Hmm. That might be even more shocking. Let's take Accra, Ghana. Using data from 2006 on water access. If you were lucky enough to have a piped connection to your home, you paid just 5 cents, U.S. cents, per 100 liters.
5 cents. Meanwhile, the general public, most people, forced to buy water in little plastic sachets from informal vendors. They were paying a staggering $8.01 per 100 liters.
$8.01 versus 5 cents. That's,
Yeah.
what is that, 160 times increase.
160-fold. For the exact same basic necessity. And that is the tangible cost of this segmentation. The logic of privatization basically ensures the poor end up subsidizing the infrastructure deficit through these cripplingly high prices.
So the international community, groups like you and Habitat, they saw this crisis emerging years ago. They launched big campaigns, right? Shelter for all, good urban governance.
Yeah.
If the need was so obvious, so widely acknowledged, why haven't these big mainstream solutions really cracked the problem?
Well, fundamentally, it's because mainstream policy is often built on this self-defeating contradiction. On the one hand, yes, these global campaigns champion really noble goals: poverty reduction, participatory democracy, the right to adequate housing. A right, by the way, that the U.S. strongly contested back at the Habitat Conference in 1996. But still, those are the stated goals.
Okay, but on the other hand,
But simultaneously, these very same policy bodies, the World Bank, bilateral donors, they advocate for policies that prioritize improving the business climate. Things like privatizing urban services, offering big tax incentives to attract foreign investment. These policies might seem economically sound for global capital, but they are often mutually exclusive with equity. They inevitably reinforce the very marginalization they claim they want to fight.
and a perfect example of this kind of policy failure, maybe misguided hope, is that theory popularized by Hernando de Soto, the freehold title fallacy.
It sounded so compelling, didn't it? Like a magic bullet for poverty.
Oh, absolutely. De Soto's argument was seductive. He said, look, just formalize informal land tenure. Give poor people individual freehold titles to their shacks or plots, and bam, you unlock their hidden capital. Their property suddenly becomes collateral. They can get loans, start businesses, climb out of poverty. It seemed logical.
But then they actually tried it on a massive scale in Peru. And the reality check was pretty harsh. There was a big review of their titling program. They issued something like 1.4 million titles between 96 and 2004. And it showed that only, 1.6% of those title holders actually got a loan using the property as collateral. Just 1.6%. And the reason why is absolutely key. The banks looked at it and basically said, well, the paper title is nice, but what we really care about is, do you have a regular job, a reliable income, stable socioeconomic conditions? That was far more important than the deed itself. So the title alone wasn't enough. And in fact, if titling is done without a whole integrated package of other support policies, it can actually just increase land values, attract speculators, and end up accelerating the exclusion of the poor, making things worse.
And the root diagnosis here, threading through our sources, seems to be that these huge, well-funded policy frameworks are fundamentally apolitical. What does that mean in practice?
Yes, apolitical. They fail, often deliberately, to account for the messy reality of power dynamics on the ground. They tend to ignore deeply embedded challenges like patronage politics, where public resources get traded for political support, or clientelism, where your loyalty to some powerful figure determines if you get access to basic services or not. So when mainstream programs push for these short, quick, supposedly consensus-driven stakeholder forums, like the city's alliances model, it often just becomes a recipe for the already powerful, the established commercial industrial banking interests to define the priorities and reinforce their own position, all under the sort of neutral banner of planning.
Okay, so if that formal top-down approach is often flawed, maybe even co-opted, where does real, meaningful systemic change come from? The source material seems to ask us to shift our gaze, to stop seeing the urban poor just as passive victims, and instead recognize their inherent generative powers.
This is such a crucial shift in perspective, and it leads us directly to SF Bayat's concept of quiet encroachment, which describes the silent, often slow, very atomized actions of ordinary people. Millions of tiny acts, really, to claim essential social goods. Things like staking out a small piece of land, illegally tapping into a water main or an electricity line, setting up an informal food stall in public space.
So it's not like a big organized protest march necessarily. It's more cumulative, a kind of political process happening under the radar.
Exactly. It's not always confrontational. It's
Yeah.
not just defensive, like protecting what little they have. It's this ongoing, subtle expansion of their space, their autonomy from the state. And it allows the marginalized to consolidate these little micro gains, which over time can actually change the political reality on the ground. It shifts the facts.
And then, when this agency does become organized, it moves from those silent individual actions to something much more strategic, like the network of SHAC, or Slum Dwellers International, SDI.
Right. SDI affiliates, which are organized all across Africa and Asia, they practice what they sometimes call playing judo with the state. Using the state's own weight, its own momentum to kind of roll it over. Their strategy isn't usually about perpetual confrontation. It's more about setting superior precedents. They go out and build their own housing, often demonstrating they can do it larger, cheaper, and better quality than official state programs. They do this from a position of autonomy. Then, by proving the viability, the efficiency of their solutions, poor people's solutions, they compel the state to make institutional shifts, maybe hand over resources, adopt their models. It becomes this powerful demand, but made from a position of proven competence.
Fascinating. Moving beyond just physical structures, though, let's talk about how this political struggle plays out in the symbolic, the cultural domains. Because we have to confront the truly shocking levels of urban violence in some cities, like Rio de Janeiro.
Yeah, this is where we really have to pause and just acknowledge the sheer gravity. The statistics cited are, well, they're horrifying. Between 1979 and 2000, over 48,000 people died from firearm injuries just in Rio. Now, to put that number in perspective, the estimated total fatalities in the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict between 1948 and 1999 was around 13,000.
48,000 versus 13,000.
Right. So young people, particularly young men in Rio's favelas, are effectively living in an undeclared, unacknowledged war zone.
And in response to that crisis, you have groups like MB Bill, Afro-Reggae, using hip-hop, using militant reggae, not just as protest, but as a form of artistic expression.
Well, yes, and it's providing something absolutely essential, an alternative, a powerful sense of belonging, of recognition for youth who feel completely abandoned by society, by the state. MV Bill had this line about the hunger being more profound than physical hunger. It's the hunger for affection and recognition. So their music, it uses the politics, the aesthetics of rage, but uses it to force the powerful, force the wider city to engage with the symbolic, the cultural dimensions of this deep exclusion.
So if we pull all these threads together, the critique of mainstream policy, the quiet encroachment, the organized agency, the cultural politics, the ultimate conclusion from our sources seems to be that real systemic change requires embracing what they call radical democracy. And a key part of that is accepting the existence of agonistic contestation. That sounds complex.
It does, but the idea is fairly straightforward. Agonistic contestation basically means productive political conflict. It's the belief that genuine democracy isn't about everyone holding hands and reaching a nice, neat consensus all the time. It's actually about allowing power differences, different interests, different visions for the city to be fiercely debated, to be contested, fought over even. Real progress, they argue, means embracing this conflict, this friction, across all the different ways politics happens. The formal representative systems, yes, but also corporatist forums, direct action on the streets, grassroots community practice, and this crucial realm of symbolic politics we just talked about.
Okay, so looking back at the whole arc of this deep dive then, the core lesson seems pretty unambiguous. Truly transformative urban development isn't just some technical calculation for urban planners with better spreadsheets. It is fundamentally, inescapably a political struggle, rooted in these really complex power dynamics: who gets to control the land, who defines what world-class even means, and crucially, whose reality, whose daily life actually gets recognized and valued.
We've really seen that critical tension, haven't we, between the globally connected, hyper-serviced enclaves on one side and the informal, often seemingly abandoned city where the vast majority actually resides on the other. And the real work, the sources suggest, involves recognizing the legitimacy, the reality of that informal life, championing these autonomous organizations like SDI, and demanding much stronger regulatory frameworks from the state frameworks that genuinely prioritize the public good over private segmented gain.
Right. And that leads us perfectly into a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe take away from this. The key to finding a city's political tipping points, the moments where real change becomes possible, seems to involve not only supporting the poor and marginalized, but also somehow forcing the privileged, the powerful, to actually acknowledge that there are different cultures and assumptions at play within the same city limits, that their reality isn't the only one. So that therefore, maybe the next crucial step for you is to look closely at your own city, your own province or region. Don't just look at the official org chart. Ask yourself, in the day-to-day reality of local politics, where does the real functional power actually reside? The power to reallocate resources, to rezone land, to genuinely redistribute opportunity. And maybe more importantly, who's currently missing from that decision-making table. Because that's likely where the real struggle for a more equitable, a more just urban future actually begins.